Once again, it's time to explore some standout British singles from 1965. So without further ado, let's check out a few great releases that hit the shelves in April of that year. Let's begin.
She's got a ticket to ride. She's got a ticket to ride. And
April 1965 saw the release of this new single by the Beatles. Ticket to Ride saw the Fab Four moving away from the Merseybeat sound of 1963 and 1964. The move away from the Merseybeat sound had already begun with their previous single, which was released in October of the year before.
I'm in love with her and I feel fine.
The so-called rhythm and blues boom of 1964, and the success of groups such as the Rolling Stones and the Kinks, completely changed the music scene in Britain. And as a result, the Merseybeat groups who couldn't adapt to the new musical landscape started struggling to find success. The Beatles were always very aware of what was happening in the music scene, and the song I Feel Fine already saw the Beatles moving away from Merseybeat and going for a more rhythm and blues type of sound. In fact, the riff of the song was inspired by this American R&B track by Bobby Parker.
Ticket to Ride.
Ticket to Ride was an excellent track with a more mature sound and a fantastic and inventive drum pattern by Ringo Starr. Record Mirror wrote,
"It arrived just before Record Mirror went to press. Ticket to Ride is of course the A-side, a Lennon-McCartney mid-tempo beater with a distinct bluesy, almost rhythm and blues feel all the way. John and Paul sing with John's distinctive and rough-edged voice taking the actual lead. Interesting George Harrison guitar praise first, and then Ringo's drum powerhouse away behind. A #1 hit, quite definitely."
The B-side was Yes It Is, an excellent song with splendid three-part harmonies.
If you were red tonight.
The guitar was played through a volume pedal, a guitar pedal that became popular in 1964 when it was featured on the song The Crying Game by Dave Berry. Ticket to Ride was one of the best Beatles singles from 1965, and it became a huge hit. The single reached #1 in Britain and #1 in the States. In an interview later in the 70s, Lennon said that Ticket to Ride was the first heavy metal record because it had a tougher sound than any other track from that period. But the following B-side by a group called The In Crowd begs to differ with Lennon's statement. This B-side by The In Crowd is one of the most aggressive British tracks from 1965, and this is the sort of song that nowadays would be labelled as proto-punk, which is kind of ironic considering that the wild and noisy guitar featured on the song was provided by future Yes member Steve Howe. The song, with its manic intensity and gritty and unpolished sound, has achieved cult status through its appearance on several compilations over the years.
It's not the way she kisses it. It's not the way she smiles.
The In Crowd were originally formed in 1964 as 4+2, and the group featured Keith West on vocals and Junior Brown on guitar. In early 1965, Steve Howe joined the band, and the group changed its name to The In Crowd. The A-side was a cover of this classic track by Otis Redding, which was obviously not a patch on the original version.
I'll be the moon after the sun goes down to let you know I'm still around.
The single got a fair amount of promotion, with several ads appearing on most of the major music publications in Britain, and the group was even featured on television shows such as Thank Your Lucky Stars. But unfortunately, just like many television appearances from that era, the show was erased and taped over, and therefore lost forever. The single peaked at number 48. Later in late 1966, the group morphed into Tomorrow, who achieved quite a bit of success on the psychedelic underground scene in London.
Hey fellas, have you heard the news? Say the women in this town have been misused.
Not to be confused with the American band of the same name, the Byrds were formed in London in 1963, and the group featured Ronnie Wood on guitar. The A-side of the single is a good example of the amphetamine-charged mod sound that was starting to take the British scene by storm. Leaving Here was a raucous, gritty take on this Motown original by Eddie Holland, with fuzzy guitars and the sort of aggressive energy that came to define many British mod singles from that era. The B-side was an excellent original composition by Ronnie Wood.
Keeping me back and you shouldn't do that. I'm not just another man on your back.
If you pay close attention to the song, you will notice that Ronnie's guitar tone was quite ahead of its time. At that point in April 1965, Ronnie Wood had already developed a guitar sound that was already strikingly similar to that signature fuzzy guitar tone that characterized many of the tracks he recorded with the Faces in the early 70s. The Byrds never managed to score a hit in the charts, but the group enjoyed enormous popularity in clubs all over Britain, and this list of all their tour dates from 1965 stands as a testament to their popularity as a club band. Unfortunately, Decca Records did a terrible job promoting the single, and most of the major music publications in Britain didn't even bother to review it. The Byrds, however, have since become firm favourites among fans of British mod bands from the mid-60s, and there are several compilations out there featuring all the singles they recorded.
She's coming home, and so I'll try no more.
April 1965 saw the release of the Zombies' third single. The group's first 45 became a major hit, reaching number 2 in the States and number 12 in Britain. But the group struggled to replicate the success of She's Not There, and this single from April 1965 can be considered the starting point of the group's declining commercial success. She's Coming Home was an excellent song written by keyboardist Rod Argent. According to Rod Argent himself, the song was inspired by European church music, and the chord progressions featured in the song stand in stark contrast to the standard pop songs from that period.
Oh baby, 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 I'll be good to you.
The B-side was a fantastic track written by bassist Chris White.
When this day is through, I'll be leaving you. I must move on, I can't stand still.
The song featured haunting harmonies and those signature moody chord progressions that the group was known for. The strange delay effect that was added to the recording gives the track an ethereal and almost ghostly quality, which almost seems to hint at the psychedelic textures that became popular later in 1966 and especially in 1967.
Take a good look at yourself and at me.
Disc Magazine's journalist Penny Valentine wrote,
"The most underrated group in the country. I love all their records, and this is very intricate and difficult to follow. They really do some interesting things. Rod Argent wrote this song and he's very clever. The middle sounds as though it was made in a church and the piano is marvelous. Scrumptious."
The single was released in Britain on the same day as the group's first album, but the single failed to chart completely. In the States, She's Coming Home failed to even break the top 40, peaking at number 58.
This little bird that somebody sent.
The late great Marianne Faithfull released her fourth single in April 1965, featuring This Little Bird as the A-side. Written by John D. Loudermilk, the song was also released that same week by the Nashville Teens.
This little bird that somebody sent.
The New Musical Express wrote,
Rather surprisingly, Decca puts two of its main attractions in competition with each other on the same song. Written by John D. Loudermilk, Marianne Faithfull sings This Little Bird, and with a subtle change of title, the Nashville Teens offer Little Bird. It has a distinctive folksy feel, which is underlined by the lyrics. Due to a combination of her vibrato and delicate charm, Marianne's voice is ideally suited to this type of material. She's aided by a walking pace rhythm, which builds throughout, plus a fascinating harp figure, strings, and group chanting the title phrase. Not so commercial as her previous hit, but a mature and captivating styling.
The B-side was a track called Morning Sun.
I see the morning sun coming over the hill.
Both sides were arranged by Mike Leander. Later in 1967, Leander also arranged She's Leaving Home by the Beatles. And if you listen closely to Morning Sun, you'll notice that both arrangements were strikingly similar. Both songs featured similar arpeggiated harp lines that evoked a melancholic feeling. The single reached number 6 in Britain and number 32 in the States. The version by the Nashville Teens, on the other hand, only managed to reach number 38 in the UK and number 97 in the US.
End of part 1. Intermission. End of intermission. Part 2.
The Swinging Blue Jeans.
By April 1965, Mersey Beat was pretty much dead, and most of the Liverpool bands who reached success during the early days of Beatlemania were already struggling to find success. The new wave of mod bands and rhythm and blues groups that were now dominating the British scene favoured a grittier and edgier sound. And as a result, the Mersey Beat bands were suddenly seen as bland and corny. And in addition to that, unlike the Beatles, most of the Mersey Beat groups were unable to evolve and adapt to the new musical landscape. But of course, there were a few exceptions. This A-side by the Swinging Blue Jeans was an excellent doomy and cynical track, which saw the band embracing a grittier and urgent rhythm and blues type of sound. The song stood in stark contrast to the shiny optimism of their early Mersey Beat hits.
Know your mind.
The group also traded its clean-cut suits and ties image for a more hip and modern look. Make Me Know You're Mine delve into the darker side of romance, insecurity, need, and suspicion. Paired with its rhythm and blues-style arrangement, it gave the song a doomy, cynical atmosphere that set it apart from the group's usual fare. The track highlighted Ray Ennis's guitar work more than any other track by the Swinging Blue Jeans. It's arguably the best showcase of Ray Ennis's guitar work in the group's catalogue. The New Musical Express wrote,
A new one from the Swinging Blue Jeans is long overdue. It proves to be Make Me Know You're Mine. A double-time shuffle rhythm supports the wild and raucous rhythm and blues-type vocal, with the contrasting pace between backing and soloist making you sit up and take notice. Not sensational melodically, but it moves at a crashing pace, and the beat's quite startling.
Despite their efforts to adapt to the new times, the group failed to recapture their early chart success, and the single flew completely under the radar. But the song remains a hidden gem from a period of transition in the British music scene.
Bring it to me, bring your sweet love in, bring it on home to me, yeah.
April 1965 saw the release of The Animals' fifth single. The A-side was a cover of Bring It On Home to Me, and while it wasn't quite as good as Sam Cooke's superb, soulful original, it still had its own charm. Eric Burdon brought a rougher and bluesier vibe to the track, giving it a unique flavor.
So bring it to me, bring your sweet love in, bring it on home to me.
The B-side was a good bluesy composition by Eric Burdon.
Well, you've been gone 14 long days.
The highlight of the song was Alan Price's superb piano work. Penny Valentine wrote,
Bring It On Home to Me. Love, that is. And this was originally done by Sam Cooke. Dynamic treatment by this really excellent group. I think Eric's sarcastic laugh is splendid. And the angry organ playing by Alan Price is fantastic. This builds up superbly.
The single reached number 7 on the UK singles chart and number 32 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the United States. This 45 became the last Animals single to feature Alan Price on keyboards, who left the group a month later in May 1965. And speaking of Alan Price,
And if she comes to me, I'll say hello. What can I do? Can't let her go.
Alan Price produced this excellent single by the stylishly named The Hipster Image. Just like groups such as Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames or Zoot Money's Big Roll Band, the Hipster Image favoured a more sophisticated and jazzy approach to rhythm and blues. And this distinctive groove was the sort of style that was embraced in mod clubs such as the Flamingo in Soho. The B-side was another excellent song called Make Her Mine.
Looks so good, and I want to be with her.
Interestingly, Make Her Mine garnered more attention over time, becoming a popular track in the mod and northern soul scenes. The New Musical Express wrote,
The hipster image employed a clipped phrasing vocal treatment of the mid-tempo Can't Let Her Go. The flip is a fast-moving shuffle swinger called Make Her Mine. The disc was produced by the Animals organist Alan Price.
The single didn't make the charts, but both tracks have resurfaced on numerous compilations over the years, enduring as two overlooked mod treasures from the mid-60s.
I'm like a big fat spider waiting for some fluff to come by. Like a big fat spider gonna trap me to fly.
Another highlight from April 1965 was this excellent B-side by Hines. The track featured some great guitar work by future Deep Purple member Ritchie Blackmore. His playing on the track is wild, raw, aggressive, and slightly ahead of its era. At the time, Blackmore had just left the Outlaws and was a member of Hines's backing group, the Wild Boys. Just like Jimmy Page, Blackmore was a much sought-after session guitarist and played on many records from that period. By April 1965, even though he was only 22 years old, Hines was already seen as a memory from the past. Hines got his start in music in the early 60s playing bass for the Tornadoes, who scored a major hit in 1962 with Telstar. Hines later launched a solo career with producer Joe Meek and had a top 5 hit in 1963 with a song called Just Like Eddie. But Hines was a little too weird for mainstream pop and a little too pop for the weirdos. So Meek's attempt to turn him into a sort of teen idol fell flat, and the singer never managed to replicate the success of Just Like Eddie. As a result, despite still being in his early 20s, by April 1965, Hines was already viewed as a fading star from the pre-Beatles era. The A-side of this single from April 1965 was a rather mediocre cover of Don't Think Twice It's Alright by Bob Dylan.
You're the reason I'm traveling home. Don't think twice, it's alright.
The highlight here was clearly the B-side. Joe Meek considered Ritchie Blackmore the best guitarist in Britain, and his playing on this track shows exactly why Meek held him in such high regard. The future Deep Purple member played on many of Meek's productions up until the producer's death in 1967. And speaking of Ritchie Blackmore, April 1965 saw the release of this solo single by Ritchie Blackmore. The A-side, an instrumental number titled Getaway, was penned by Blackmore himself along with Chas Hodges. The two had previously played together in the Outlaws in the early 60s. The B-side was an instrumental version of the traditional song Little Brown Jug. Record Mirror wrote,
Percussive opening, then into a pacey instrumental with saxes honking honkily. A beaty sort of riff with guitar chattering away and a dominant beat. A reedy performance, but not by accident. Good for dancing.
Instrumental singles were staples of the early 60s, but by 1965 they had largely fallen out of favor. So the Blackmore single, perhaps not surprisingly, went completely unnoticed and failed to make any impact on the charts. Blackmore's career as a session guitarist continued through the late 1960s, culminating in 1968 when he became a founding member of Deep Purple. And speaking of session guitarists from the 60s, this B-side by Lulu is one of the many tracks from that era which featured Jimmy Page on guitar. The track includes one of the best solos Page recorded during his days as a session musician. Surprise Surprise was written by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. The Stones' own version of the song had already been featured a couple of months earlier on the US release of the Rolling Stones' Now. But Lulu's version marked the first time the song was released in Britain. Her take showcases her powerful, soulful vocals, giving a pop twist to the Stones' original. This was an era when Lulu was allowed to embrace her R&B influences, standing in stark contrast to her later material, which typically followed a more middle-of-the-road pop direction. The A-side was a Carole King and Jerry Goffin composition called Satisfied, which sounded a bit like a rewrite of Shout, which had been a huge hit for Lulu in 1964. The single failed to chart, probably due to its similarities to Shout, which likely limited its appeal among the record-buying public.
Every time I see you, I just go to pieces. Yeah, won't you see it now,
April 1965 saw the release of the Sorrows' second single. The A-side had an unusual start-stop rhythm that gave the song an intentionally chaotic feel, making the whole thing sound as if it was tripping over itself.
baby? Can you hear me? Calling you.
But the track is a magnificent example of the sort of wild and anarchic rhythm and blues sound that was popular in clubs all over Britain. The B-side was a frantic rhythm and blues tune called Teenage Letter.
Teenage letter, rock and roll state. Excuse me, baby, I forgot to wait because I love you.
Teenage Letter gained popularity later in the 1970s during the heyday of pub rock, and the track was covered by British pub rock groups from that period such as the Count Bishops. The Sorrows version had the sort of raw and frantic sound that characterized British rhythm and blues from that period. Record Mirror wrote,
A very jerky item which seems to take ages to get off the ground, at first hearing anyway. But the tempo picks up after about 8 bars and routines into a steady beater. At least it's different. Nice backing.
the single went pretty much unnoticed and was largely ignored by radio stations. The jagged start-stop rhythm of the A-side is very likely the reason why the single received little to no airplay. Broadcasters have always been wary of tracks with abrupt silences or unpredictable shifts in dynamics, fearing they might be mistaken for technical issues. After all, dead air remains the ultimate taboo in broadcasting. I hope you enjoyed this trip back to April 1965. See you next time.